Welcome back after what I imagine was a delicious lunch. You're in for a treat today, this afternoon, with this magnificent panel presided by my colleague Phoebe Okoa. But first, let me introduce you to my colleague in the leadership of ICON-S, Wojciech Szyderski. Wojciech really needs no introduction. I will tell you, however, that he's a dear colleague of ours at ICON-S. We rely on him for his counsel, for his support, and for his always useful and helpful suggestions. Wojciech is going to introduce you to one of our dear partners for this conference, and I'll let him tell you more about that partner.
Thank you very much, Richard, and welcome to everybody. My distinct pleasure and privilege is to introduce to you Caroline Eschenfelder of Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Now, Caroline is currently advisor for law and politics at the main office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Berlin, in the Department of Democracy, Rule of Law, and Political Parties. So as you say, her title and her affiliation 100% resonates with the interests and focus of this conference and this society. On behalf of the leadership of the Council of ICON-S, I would like to welcome Caroline, but in addition, I would like to acknowledge and recognize the great support which we receive from Konrad Adenauer Foundation. We have been lucky enough to be beneficiaries of their support for some time now, including earlier in Il Mundo conference, now here, and we hope very much that it will continue well into the future. But I would like, just in 10 seconds, make a little reminiscence to bolster my enthusiasm and to make it credible for Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Exactly 10 years ago, me and a group of my friends in Sydney, some of whom participate in this Congress, though I'm not sure I can see them now. These were Adam Czarnota, Martin Krieger, and Jeremy Weber, plus some other colleagues, Tionis Ru, whom many of you may know. We decided to do something to promote constitutional democracy in Myanmar. Actually, at that stage, it was still usually called Burma. And it was a very ambitious project because Myanmar was still ruled by the military government. Aung San Suu Kyi was still in a under de facto home arrest. But we saw the winds of change, and we thought that we should, without any patronizing, without any aspects of paternalism, help them with our expertise on principles of constitution making and constitutional democracy. And of course, we needed support, including financial support. We looked around and we came across people from Konrad Adenauer Foundation, their Singapore office, and later their Bangkok office. And I must say that in a reasonably long life, not just of scholarship, but also a degree of activism, I'm yet to encounter a group, an institution, which would combine their attachment to democratic values, their expertise, and also, yes, their generosity as Konrad Adenauer Foundation. They became our main sponsor in this program. They gave us lots of expertise. They helped us also bring their experts who supplemented this Sydney group. So when I say that Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a group that ICON-S has plenty to thank for and to expect happy collaboration to the future, I really do it with a degree of personal credibility. So now Caroline has studied in Heidelberg, in other universities, in Aix-Marseille in France, and Chinese University of Hong Kong, after which she joined Konrad Adenauer Foundation in 2016, and as a representative of the office, the name of which I just gave a moment ago, she will present to you a very general outline of this incredible institution. So, Caroline, thank you very much, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Sidorsky, for your kind introduction. It's a real privilege and pleasure to me to be here today and to be given the opportunity to present the work of CAS, and especially our rule of law programs. So good afternoon to everyone. I want to jump right into the presentation to fully use my 10 minutes. For those who don't know us very quickly, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, short CAS, is a German political foundation which runs more than 200 projects in over 120 countries worldwide. So our headquarters, great, thanks. Our headquarters are in Berlin, but we work on the national as well as on the international level. So we have more than 100 offices abroad, which you can see here. The small orange dots are the offices abroad. And additionally, we have the rule of law programs, which are the big circles. I'm going to come back to that later. Our work includes, very generally speaking, the civic education and political consultancy, both nationally and internationally, the promotion of peace, liberty, democracy and justice, and of course the rule of law, the dialogue among representatives from politics, the economy, society, church and science, and the training and education of young professionals. Actually, the CAS has been active in international cooperation since the last 50 years, so for quite a while. The main goals of our international commitment are fostering, as I just said, democracy and also economic development, as well as the respect for human rights. And with this, I'm coming back to the rule of law. Of course, the promotion of the rule of law is one of the top priorities in our work. Thus, since 1990, the CAS has been supplementing its global projects in the offices abroad with the transnational, worldwide rule of law programs. So we have 6 rule of law programs worldwide on different continents. We have 1 in Latin America, 2 in Africa, 1 in Asia, 1 for the Middle East and North Africa, and 1 in and for Southeast Europe. The bases are for Latin America in Bogota, Colombia, then for Sub-Saharan Africa, Anglophone speaking, for the Anglophone countries in Nairobi, Kenya, then for the Francophone countries in Dakar, Senegal, in Singapore for Asia, then in Beirut, Lebanon for Middle East and North Africa, and in Bucharest, Romania for Southeast Europe. Again, generally speaking, we are committed to the promotion of rule of law structures and central institutional elements of the rule of law, such as effective constitutional courts, then the promotion of the separation of powers, particularly a strong, established and independent judiciary and a legitimate executive. And of course, the strengthening of regional networks dedicated to safeguarding both the rule of law and democracy. I want to go ahead speaking a bit about our method, specifically concerning the rule of law programs. So the separate rule of law programs support educational measures and dialogue programs that are focused on meeting local needs. They really are organized on this regional level. For example, by organizing international and national conferences, seminars, workshops, and panel discussions, as well as trainings and courses. But also we're doing more traditional projects like publications, or as well multimedia products like podcasts. And besides that, we're granting university scholarship to gifted young professionals to support them. And we're organizing and hosting visitor programs in Germany and Europe, which is also a vital part of our work. Just to give you a quick overview of our target groups and partners, I just want to mention that we're working together with legal practitioners, officers from bodies of the judiciary and the administration of justice, as well as with legal scholars, with members of the parliament, with members of the government, and also with non-governmental organizations, church associations, and media representatives. It really depends on the project we're currently working on. In every rule of law program, there is a German jurist with international expertise who directs the regional rule of law program. And their work, again, is coordinated from the CAS headquarters in Berlin. And now let me just very quickly show you my presentation, just to present you my colleagues abroad in the rule of law programs, and to give you some examples of our projects so that you get an insight and a picture of what we're actually doing. So let's jump to Latin America, to Bogota in Colombia. There is my colleague Hartmut Rank. Actually, that is our oldest rule of law program. It exists since 30 years already. And one big project we're having here is the meeting of the Latin American constitutional judges last time. That took place in 2019 for obvious reasons. And it already was the 25th annual of Latin American constitutional judges meetings, sorry. But it's not only the Latin American judges that come together and get in touch, it's also the judges from the German Constitutional Court who come and get in touch with the Latin American judges. Then we jump to Singapore, to Asia, to my colleague Stefan Samse. That is an example for a workshop or right shop we organized there. It was a regional research right shop on access to justice in Asia. There we supported the Center for Peace and Justice of the BRIC Uni in Bangladesh. The aim of this project was for the attendees to publish 2 books, and the objective of the right shop was to provide some feedback to them for the drafts of their papers to ensure a certain level of academic value. Then we're going to go ahead to Southeast Europe, to Dr. Pavel Uzvatov. Leaders for Justice is a leadership program for young professionals. So it's especially for young Romanian professionals who can apply. And if they get in, they can attend a variety of trainings on ethics, projects, project management, and more. Then we're going to go to Sub-Saharan Africa, to Nairobi, Kenya, to Dr. Stefanie Wotenberger. She has done quite a new thing for us. She has done a documentary quite recently about how ordinary citizens can pursue environmental justice. It was premiered on June 13 in 2022. She planned that during the COVID pandemic. So if you're interested, just have a look and check it out. We're quite excited about this new format. And then to Ingo Badurek, to Senegal, which is the youngest program we established because we realized that it's worth having 2 programs for the several parts of Africa. He has done, that's an example for a more traditional format. He's done a publication with the title Crise de l'état de droit en Afrique de l'Ouest, where they were analyzing the different crises in the different African countries. And the last program is in Beirut with Philipp Bremer. He has organized an international symposium on mapping constitutional control in the MENA region. That was the final meeting and the result of a series of expert meetings that the Rule of Law program, together with the Arab Association for Constitutional Law, organized. And then, last but not least, let me present my colleague, Dr. Franziska Rinke, who is the coordinator for the Rule of Law programs. She can't be here today, unfortunately. I'm here for her, and I'm sending the best wishes from her. She, as I just said, coordinates the different Rule of Law programs, but as well, she's working on the global perspective, on global questions on the Rule of Law. That was it. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for giving me the forum, the forum and the audience to presenting the work of CAS and the Rule of Law programs. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to approach me and to ask me anything you want to know. I'm here until the end of the conference. And now I am looking very forward to our plenary panel on global health. Thank you very much, and I wish you fruitful discussions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our panel on global public health challenges and perspectives. I'm Phoebe Okoa. I'm Professor of Public International Law at Queen Mary, University of London, and a member of the ICONES Executive Committee. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Okay, sorry. So it's perhaps the greatest understatement to say that the pandemic has had a profound effect on all of us. Of its many consequences is the stark realization that the existing legal and institutional frameworks, both at the international and the national legal systems level, are wholly inadequate. At the international level, the World Health Organization has focused on assessing its own preparedness and the adequacy of its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, with a view to developing effective frameworks and structures for responding to threats in the future. As a UN organization with primary responsibility for health, the WHO also plays a coordinating role in trying to make sense of fragmented national responses. But its exact mandate, especially in relation to information sharing and distribution of vaccines on a fair and equitable basis, remains deeply contested. At the national level, as is well known, many states took emergency measures to reduce and prevent the risk of harm to their populations. And some of these measures are really difficult to reconcile with human rights norms and with rules and principles of democratic governance. They are also, in many cases, in tension with civil liberties guaranteed under the constitution of most states. Many pandemic measures, even well-intentioned, have been criticized for being overbroad and left in place for too long, raising concerns about their compatibility with democratic governance. So our three panelists, between them, have spent a considerable amount of time thinking through these issues and will, in the course of the next 60 minutes, unpack them for us. Our first speaker, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they are going to speak, is Dr. Pedro Villarreal. Pedro is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Law and International Law. At the Max Planck Institute, Pedro is the co-manager of an interdisciplinary project on global governance. A Mexican national, Pedro completed his PhD from the National Autonomous University of Mexico with a dissertation on pandemics, appropriately, and the law. The dissertation was awarded a prize for the best doctoral thesis in law and the social sciences. Our second speaker to my right is Professor Jody Sando from the Central European University, the Faculty of Political Science, Legal, and Gender Studies. Judith is not only a professor of law, but she was also, between 2004 and 2005, chief of the bioethics section at UNESCO. Judith has published numerous books and scientific papers in the fields of human rights and bioethics. And our third, and by no means last speaker, is Professor Siri Gopens. Siri is Professor of Political Science and the Vice Dean of Research of the Social Sciences Faculty at the University of Bergen. And she is also the founding director of Law Transform, Center on Law and Social Transformation. Her research agenda is broadly interdisciplinary. It lies at the intersection of law and politics, with a broad experience from cross-regional interdisciplinary research, investigating legal mobilization and the role of law and courts, including in health, abortion, LGBTIQ, and politics, among others. So those are our three panelists, and I think without saying any more, I will call on our first speaker. Each of our speakers, just a reminder on what we agreed, will speak for 20 minutes, so we have 60 minutes in total. I will appropriately, after 15 minutes, signal that you should be wrapping up, and then call on to the next speaker. I think we'll have to wait for all our three speakers before we open the floor for discussions and your interventions. And so without much more, the floor is yours, Dr. Villarreal.
Yes, thanks so much, Professor Okowa. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers and say hats off for this massive undertaking of holding this event in such challenging circumstances, and of course for giving me the opportunity to share the panel with three outstanding scholars, all of whom I admire deeply. And in my presentation, I will focus on the role of the World Health Organization. As Fibiakova already was explaining, this organization was at the center of attention because it's the main international organization with the mandate in the field of global health, and certainly including pandemics. And in order to offer an assessment of what the WHO's role was during the pandemic, I will argue for a combination, or the fusion, if you would say it, between public international law and comparative public law studies. And this is in the spirit as well of the International Society of Public Law. And I know that's easier said than done to fuse both of them. Each of these fields is gigantic, but nevertheless, I will show you that only this way can we get a better assessment of really what the legal role of the WHO has been during the pandemic and how this can help us visualize some stepping stones for future pandemics. So to start the discussion, I first lay the premise that what we see in the terms of the variation of national legal responses, the wild variation of national legal responses, if I may say, as already pointed out by Professor Okowa, is because we have no quote-unquote global health police. What do I mean by this? I mean an international organization that would be capable of exercising at the international level what under comparative law is known as police powers. The power to mandate its addressees or its subjects exactly what to do and when in case of a health event. It can be a pandemic or it can be other health threats. We do not have such global health police. And that actually, this decision not to have a global health police, of course, I'm not saying it's a wrong decision, I'm not advocating for one, but it goes all the way back to the International Health Conference, which took place in New York in 1946, where a number of delegates met to negotiate the creation of a new organization, namely in the field of health. This organization will become the WHO. And of course, among the items for negotiations was what kind of powers should this organization have. A few of delegates did somehow put the idea on the table, well, why not have a supranational organization that in the case of emergencies, at least of health emergencies like pandemics, could override national sovereignty and mandate states what to do exactly and when. But this idea was discarded. It was too ambitious, and obviously, the consensus was not reached on such an organization that could override national sovereignty to that extent. So instead, what we see in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, itself an international treaty, is that the organization is still mostly dependent on the consent by its states to really follow either its guidelines, as I will present later, and to agree upon what will be done in the case of pandemics. And nevertheless, it is in theory possible to give more powers to the WHO under the existing constitution. We would need a reform, but absent this reform, we do not have any global health police, and of course the organization itself will still be dependent on what member states allow it to do. Now, this is not the end of the story, of course. Instead, we can witness how the WHO exercises legal and epistemic authority, so legal understanding that it does have some powers in the field of health emergencies, and epistemic authority as it becomes a technical organization that conveys information, conveys best practices, technical guidance on states on what to do when a pandemic does emerge, like COVID-19. But ultimately, the constitution of the WHO is the basis for the existing international law instrument on this field of cross-border spread of disease, the International Health Regulations of 2005. These regulations entered into force in 2007 for all WHO member states, 194, and 2 other states acceded to these regulations. And that's, in the current juncture of COVID-19, we see how in Geneva, in the seat of the WHO, there are ongoing negotiations either to reform these regulations or to create a new convention on pandemic preparedness and response. And each of them would envisage different procedures for entering into force. With the regulations, national ulterior ratification is not needed. With the convention, it would be needed. And this, of course, will determine how complicated the ongoing negotiations may become in the near future. But what we currently have and what we had at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was the regulations, right, the international health regulations. And I will focus on two issues related to these regulations to see how the WHO exercises its legal powers. These regulations, on the one hand, enshrine obligations for states to notify the WHO of events that occur within their territories and that may be emergencies, health emergencies, within 24 hours after they have detected the event and they know that something is wrong. And so this is an obligation that states have towards the WHO. And then the WHO itself has, the WHO Director General particularly has the power to declare a public health emergency of international concern. This emergency, I should emphasize, does not lead to new obligations. As I mentioned, the WHO cannot really oblige states to act in a specific manner. Nevertheless, it's an act that Armin von Mogdani and I have deemed to be governance by information, meaning the WHO does convey this information and says there's an emergency, we should react. Of course, the way in which the states should react, it's up to them, mostly legally speaking. But this act does matter, as I will show later. So on the basis of the reports that the WHO receives, it may declare an emergency or not. So this is what the first dimension I will focus on. And the second dimension, more related to the different national legal responses we see throughout the pandemic, is, as referred by Phoebe Okowa, the fact that in this legal puzzle, right, that where every country seemed to have made its own decisions independently of each other, independently of an international, any international guidance on the matter, the WHO can also recommend states what to do under the regulations. It does have a mandate to say, well, we think this is the best approach to against or to fight the virus. And it's up to states, of course, to then pay heed to what the WHO recommends or not. Well, so these two dimensions I will focus on, and so much for law in books. Right? What does law in action look like with regards to these two dimensions? So I will refer to a recent study we conducted in the ages of, I'm a member among others of the Global Health Law Consortium, and with two colleagues, Rujin Habibi and Alan Taylor, we looked at the WHO's invisible disease surveillance, invisible because at least before COVID-19, there were so many events being reported that were not really in the public's attention. And these reports, again, are in the fulfillment of an obligation under Article 6 of these regulations. So states and national authorities must convey the information to the WHO of these events. It may be small outbreaks of infectious or communicable diseases. It may be related to food security as well. But this is what it more or less looked like before COVID-19. And this is, of course, not as visible since the regulations entered into force in 2007, when this obligation began to report to the WHO. Until the emergence of COVID-19, we had more than 4,200 events reported to the WHO, and most of them had to do with small outbreaks of communicable diseases that were fortunately put off. And then we see how this is a constant obligation, a constant surveillance that the WHO conducts on the basis of what states inform it. And among these thousands, literally thousands of events, we do find, of course, the more high-profile occasions, like, for example, H1N1 influenza in 2009, of course, was one of these hundreds of events reported on the year 2009. We have also the West African Ebola crisis in 2014, another of the hundreds of reports received that year. And more recently, at the end of December 2019, we have, of course, COVID-19. Now, as I was mentioning before, the WHO director can decide whether these events, any of these events, is an emergency or not. And it has done so in the past. COVID-19 is the sixth such occasion that an emergency is declared, a public health emergency of international concern. And so, as I was mentioning, well, it doesn't lead to any new obligations, and yet the WHO was heavily criticized in several events, either because it declared the emergency too soon, it declared the emergency, with H1N1 influenza, it declared the emergency too late, like with the West African Ebola crisis. And now with COVID-19, of course, the jury is still out. Did it declare it a bit too late, or was it on time? But so this raises the question, if it does not lead to any new obligations, why do these emergency declarations matter so much anyway? Well, and that's, in order to understand, right, or to better grasp why these emergencies matter so much, this is where a further study looking into comparative public law is useful to understand what national authorities are doing whenever the WHO declares an emergency or when it issues guidance on specific measures, right? Because as I was explaining, besides declaring the emergency, the WHO can indeed recommend which measures to adopt. So what does this look like in terms of what states are doing? And here I refer to comparative public law insights from the Less COVID-19 project, which I am honored to be part of alongside outstanding colleagues, a number of colleagues, and the project is led by Jeff King from UCL and Octavio Ferraz from King's College London. In this project, several colleagues and I had a look at a survey of dozens of countries. We made a first survey across 48 jurisdictions, not just countries, sorry, it's 48 jurisdictions, including 46 countries, a special administrative region, Hong Kong, and the European Union. And here we looked at, for example, what national authorities were doing when the WHO declared an emergency. So several of these countries, well, maybe it's when we combined first the emergency declaration that occurred on the 30th of January of 2020, and then the later pandemic declaration, which, by the way, is not enshrined in any instrument, but it's more of an informal declaration, we see how there's a higher degree of reference made to this pandemic declaration. Again, a declaration that is more informal, it's not established in any legally binding instrument, and yet states seem to have reacted more to this declaration than to the first one, maybe because it was later and several of them, let's put it harshly, probably ignored the first one and then had a belated response. But this is what we see in national legal acts. We see that these declarations are referred to when acting upon, to face COVID-19. I would also emphasize, sorry, that this is a project focused on national legal responses to COVID-19, so it's not including past such events. But what about, and also to show you how the list of countries or jurisdictions, and what about the guidance that the WHO is giving states on which measures to adopt? To what extent are national authorities legally relying upon the WHO when they adopt certain acts? And here I have been working on a spectrum within the same project as well, of different degrees of depth of this legal reliance upon the WHO, from the lowest to the highest. And of course, these categories are subjective. I'm aware that it belongs to my own preferences in assessing what do I see as a very high reliance upon the WHO. I'll mention briefly a few examples, but here we have the list of jurisdictions. I hope that's also, the font is big enough for those of you at the back. But we have, among these multiple jurisdictions, a wide variation in the depth to which national authorities rely upon the WHO's guidance. How do we see this guidance? For example, we see no reliance, which was the case in Ethiopia. Or we see that simply there's no reference made, and it seems that national authorities did not pay heed at all to the WHO. But we see also at the other extreme of this spectrum, we have a very high reliance upon the WHO. What do I mean by this? The reliance is such that these countries, let's put, for example, Brazil, have included in their legislation, so in domestic legislation, had made it conditional apologies, had made the national declaration of emergency due to COVID-19 conditional upon the WHO's own declaration of an emergency. There will be a national emergency, broadly speaking, as long as the WHO says there is an international emergency. So we see this as a higher level of reliance upon the WHO to the extent that really national acts are made dependent on the WHO. Another example, very briefly, in Mexico, which my country of origin, where a federal court used the WHO's guidance on personal protective equipment for medical personnel against COVID-19 as a yardstick for issuing an injunction that mandated the government to uphold the WHO's guidance as the necessary level of protection offered to healthcare personnel. We see that the WHO's guidance in this jurisdiction is such that, you know, if national authorities do not follow that guidance, they are breaching the rights of these persons. And I would only add, and I would emphasize that this survey was possible thanks to the work done by dozens of country rapporteurs from all of these jurisdictions who filled a common author guidance code designed by us within Lex Atlas COVID-19. And it is thanks to their work, of course, that we could get all of this information, on granular information, on which legal acts nationally, again, under comparative public law, how we can see the WHO's guidance playing a role in the response, the legal response to COVID-19. And again, the degrees and the types of legal acts vary wildly as well. And so it can be either emergency declarations, and we have, and that's closely related to our other topics of today. We have, of course, those measures. They may restrict human rights or individual liberties, where, of course, national authorities have cited the WHO as a justification even for adopting restrictions on human rights. And perhaps as a game of blame shifting by saying, well, if these measures may be unpopular, say some national authorities, but we are adopting them mainly because the WHO said so. So it's not us we are not the ones that are putting you through this. It's because we're following the WHO's guidance on, for example, you know, whether lockdowns are appropriate, quote unquote lockdowns, whether, you know, quarantines or isolations and all those measures that are really restrictive of our individual freedoms. So we see how there's, of course, this game of blame, there may be a game of blame shifting, but nevertheless, the point stands that we do see a reliance upon the WHO's guidance. And why is this relevant? There are some caveats. I will not go into details on some caveats related to how far we can read into this data, how far we can go with the conclusions from this data, but nevertheless, we have at least identified that there are such levels of reliance upon the WHO's guidance. So what do we make of this? Well, in the ongoing negotiation processes in Geneva to either reform the regulations or to create a new convention on pandemic preparedness and response, a series of normative debates are re-emergent or being revived. The normative debates that look a lot like those debates that were held in 1946 by the delegates that created the WHO, to mainly focus on the question, what kind of WHO do we want? What kind of WHO should we have for facing future pandemics? And this, of course, will require learning a lot of lessons from COVID-19, including these ones, right? And in my view, the best approach towards these normative debates is to take the perspective of those countries that have a very high reliance upon the WHO and make them the yardstick also for holding, for instance, the WHO accountable when it gets its guidance wrong, when it can and has gotten it wrong. And if some countries are relying upon it for its guidance heavily, so there should be some sort of accountability, right? We should be worried whenever the WHO makes mistakes because it can lead to consequences at the national level, as we have seen in this comparative law studies. And lastly, before concluding, I would only add that we ought to remember that, okay, I focused on the WHO throughout the presentation, but we do have a global health arena that is crowded. It's not just the WHO, it is a number of other international organizations, and non-state actors as well that play a prominent role in providing an effective legal response against pandemics. And we have all of these, just to mention a few examples, the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is a strong donor of the WHO, Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, which procures and distributes vaccines, and it's a public-private partnership. So all of these actors are in the field of global health, and though the WHO cannot certainly mandate them on what to do in a pandemic, maybe we can think of an organization that could exercise a more centrifugal role, one of creating synergies, of coordinating, as Vybiakova was alluding to at the beginning. Maybe. So this, in my view, should inform the ongoing debates. And to conclude, in closing, we should also keep in mind that future pandemics may look quite differently than COVID-19. May have very different features. They may be more mild. They may be more severe. We don't know. So we would indeed do well to keep this perspective in mind, always remembering that, as the German football slang states, after the pandemic is before the pandemic. We need to be prepared for the next stage of the game, and this involves, keeping a broader perspective that includes both international and comparative law perspectives. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, could I just ask you to hold on to your questions? I'm sure you have a lot of burning questions. Dr. Biariel has raised and pointed out some very important questions, including the perennial question about accountability of international organizations and their responsibility to states, an area in which there is a gap, and I will reassure you that the International Law Commission is taking that on its agenda. How do we hold these international organizations as well responsible to states? But there are also huge difficulties around questions about if you have, how do we manage a common problem in a world order that is still very much based on entrenched claims to state sovereignty. So I think, without saying more, I think I should call on to Professor Sando to take the floor. The floor is yours, Judith.
Thank you very much, Dzień dobry. I would like to refer to two disciplines which are both very close to my heart. One is human rights, and the other one is bioethics. And I would like how these two disciplines are very helpful in giving some responses to us. What happened to human rights during and after the pandemic, and what can we do in order to revitalize them or rebalancing them? There was a bioethicist, Daniel Callahan, who one of his last book referred to the 5 horsemen of the modern world, mentioning climate, food, water, disease, and obesity. It was before the COVID-19, and I think that these challenges reminds us to the 4 horsemen of apocalypse, and I think these are even much closer to our understanding what's happening now when we refer to death, famine, war, and the conquest. So if we think about these challenges, which are, of course, one of them is a disease and a pandemic, then we also have to look at other disciplines. What is the main lessons learned from anthropology, ethics, and human rights? And one of the major lessons, which I would like to also connect at the last part of my presentation when I think about how to rebalance the catalogue of human rights, how to revitalize the catalogue of human rights, which Margaret Mead mentioned once, that when we think about the first sign of civilization, we are not referring to inventing of a special tool or weapon, but it was the first sign when a human survived of a broken bone. This is the sign when someone was pulling him or her into the cave and taking care of him. And this should be considered as a sign of civilization. I think it's a very important lesson when we think about such public health challenges. But there is a dark side of the pandemic challenge, necessity and emergence, which is always testing the constitutional framework, and which is also forcing us to have emergency measures. There are lots of emergencies, and we encountered that during the last 2 or 3 years, we faced lots of emergencies, state of emergency, health emergency, and also within the healthcare sector, there were a lot of measures which were implemented in order to secure, for instance, healthcare. We also know from the history that even the pharaohs wanted to have a power over the reserve. Someone who has a power over the reserve, who can distribute later in hard times, has also had a ruling power. And also Foucault mentions the security apparatus. So this is a very strong biopolitical challenge, the pandemic, and of course it's very much close to how the politics is trying to manage these challenges. The other word which I think should be mentioned, and I think we all felt this shift during the pandemic, that previously we identified ourselves as autonomous human beings. So there was an emphasis on the individual. And during the pandemic, there were many situations when we had to imagine ourselves as part of a community. So herd immunity, we had to comply with certain rules which were not chosen by us. And then this is of a contagion becomes again of a community that's created us a community. That's also of Paolo Giordano, for instance, emphasizing that. And the other thing which refers to human as a part of the community is that we tend to think about ourselves as and people who we lost during the pandemic as statistical victims. And we know from ethics that people's attitude to individual victim and statistical victim is a very different one. And then during the pandemic, many countries, for instance, in my country, Hungary, they started to list the age of the people who died with the disease. And we didn't think any longer as individual human beings behind these figures, but they were statistical victims. Also from Italy, in Bergamo, when the pandemic took the toll of lots of life, they invented a so-called WhatsApp deaths, when people couldn't say goodbye to their relatives, and they tried to offer some technical help, at least they could say goodbye using technical measures. So we see that we fundamentally changed our vision about the individual within the society, and it's a major challenge in history. Should we get back to the history or to learn from historical example? This is the first law of quarantine from Ragusa. It's a present part of Dubrovnik from the 14th century, but we don't have to go that long back in time, because I think it's even a part of the modern times when Spanish flu, AIDS, polio, Ebola, MERS, and now COVID-19 shaped the politics, shaped how the society had to react, also appeared in important historical moments. For instance, 1956, when there was a revolution in Hungary, it was also the same time when the population was very much hit by the polio pandemic. Now, what are the specificities of the COVID-19? If we can learn from the history and try to see how the world reacted differently than the previous pandemics. Of course, the collectivity and the community aspects was emphasized also by the WHO. No one is safe until everyone is safe. We learned that even individual cannot buy him or herself outside of the measures. We have to tackle these issues together. But also, if we look at how human rights were challenged during and after the COVID pandemic, I think we have to focus not only on right to health, which is of course obviously an important right which has been challenged, but if we look at each of the rights, we could see almost all of them were affected. Also, for instance, respect to autonomy. If you just some examples in the field of healthcare, previously we had the right to choose a doctor, to have a second opinion. All these rights has disappeared from one day to another during the pandemic, or right to refuse medical treatment. We're no longer speaking about it during the pandemic, which were previously a very important bioethical issue. Of course, right to health is also access to healthcare was seriously compromised during the pandemic. We still have long waiting lists. And of course, we couldn't select between treatments. But also right to privacy. We had to report data, of course, in order to tackle the pandemic. We had to disclose test results for the employers. Also, we had to comply to the vaccines, whether we had the vaccines or not. And a lot of data were uploaded about our health, which is, of course, related to right to privacy. But even scientific freedom were compromised in many places, especially where politics took a leading role in communicating scientific facts, which is, of course, many times compromised scientific freedom, but it's also because it was the first time that the people could see how science operates in the real time. Previously, I think people got used to the scientists disclosed the big success when they invented something. But now they had to see the hesitant scientists who may say something one day, but then as we learned more about the pandemic, has to override this and to have another information. And unfortunately, that's related to losing the credibility of science and fake news. And we also know, we have to also deal with that when we think about revitalizing the human rights after the pandemic. Free speech was also compromised in some country. This is the famous case of Li Wenliang, the Chinese ophthalmologist who was the first who wanted to warn the world that this virus can spread from human to human, not only from animal to human, and he was silenced in the beginning, and it was also delaying the information. So I think that another important historical episode, and I think the first presentation already referred to that after the Second World War, many times after huge global trauma, there is a special occasion to reconsider human rights. After the Second World War, a lot of important human rights were born. There was a consensus, and of course that was the time when right to health was crystallized. And in the same time, maybe some of these early formulations of right to health was later criticized. This is the formulation from 1946, because later they consider it's a mere rhetorical explanations like the access to the highest attainable standard of health. And I think that that's a pity that it later became a source of criticism and people started to ignore right to health. Although it has been restated in some other documents, for instance, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but it's also considered as a major right in several other documents. But around the 70s, 80s, they also started to consider that second generation of human rights should not be mentioned on the same page as the first generation of human rights. Right to health seemed to be a suspicious right, very costly, and then they started to think about these are merely rhetorical explanations and formulations. And of course, there was also several austerity packages which affected right to health. The Charter of Fundamental Rights, later the European Union, was much more specific, much more cautious how restating the right to health, but there is a right of access, for instance, specific healthcare services. The current challenges, I refer mainly before the COVID pandemic because it's important to understand. Unfortunately, international organizations didn't have such a high reputation as previously, and unfortunately when the COVID pandemic started, it reached international organizations and human rights not in a good shape. People were, as I said, very skeptical about it, and also the role of WHO has been diminished, and I think that was a problem when the crisis broke out. And there was definitely a moment when it was difficult to immediately to react together. There was a problem with global solidarity, also within Europe, to help each other when the pandemic broke out. And right-based approach, nevertheless, I think it would be very useful even during the pandemic, because human rights offer of a more coherent, comprehensive, and practical framework. We always forget about it. It is also helping to understand how ethics of care is important, and how public health dramatically worsen when human rights are ignored. And also vice versa. I think what we learned during the pandemic, that we couldn't exercise other rights when our health is compromised. But when we think about measures, we also have to think, and we spoke about vaccine nationalism and different legal treatment, that actually the significant differences could have been witnessed among countries, how they tackle, for instance, vaccination. We forget the public health measures in several previous state socialist countries. There were mandatory measures already implemented in case of vaccines. So for them it was a very different attitude towards vaccination. It's a coincidence that the European Court of Human Rights had to deal with mandatory vaccination in a case which was unrelated to COVID vaccinations, but it has been interpreted also in relation to COVID vaccines. It has been challenged by different professionals of mandatory vaccinations, and even if we know that there were mandatory vaccinations in the field of public health in some countries, mainly vaccines given for children. So should we need going back again to ethics and the way how I framed the first sign of civilization. So this is also a very important book on the duty of care, how we should also think about it as an important dimension of societies after a pandemic. Should we include them, and should we refer to duty of care also as influencing the human rights? What are the potential scenarios? I think that's also important to highlight. One is that biopolitical state is developing, and there will be more control and tracing, and vulnerable populations would be a more difficult situation, and emergency will be upheld. In many countries, actually, the emergency has been prolonged for a long period of time. We might say, with a little exaggeration, that it's COVID-19 84 will be one negative scenario. The other one is when post-COVID solidarity will be recognized. We'll learn how important is health and our vulnerability, and there will be more solidarity exercise. We will also try to give a new interpretation, reinforce the right to health, because we recognize that it's essential condition to exercise other rights. And of course, we can live with also technical possibilities, but it's self-monitoring, of self-testing, and we try to put autonomy even in these measures. That would be a positive scenario. And also we may enhance the right to health within interpretations, learning from the pandemic. The status of being healthy will be a very important and relevant factor in all aspects of life. But of course, there are elements which may reduce these initiatives: scarcity of resources, necessity, isolation, and also vaccine nationalism, which we also encountered during the pandemic. So at the end, I would like to have some arguments for rebalancing and reconstructing human rights. I think it's a moment after this major pandemic event to consider and reinforce human rights, because almost all of them were affected during the pandemic. We also have to see the importance of healthcare, and then those countries when it was underfinanced, and you could see that it's contributed to the huge losses. So not only the pandemic, for instance, in my country, the accessibility of healthcare was seriously compromised, and I think for 100,000 population, we had significant losses. So as a conclusion, I would like to see that the COVID-19 pandemic, as human rights lawyers, we could also see as an opportunity to reconsider the human rights catalog, to think about what is the role of right to health, right to healthcare, and to prioritize healthcare, because it was the first global international pandemic when we should be refrained to go to doctor in order to flatten the curve. So this is a very strange. Previously, we always heard that we have to go to the doctor whenever we see some kind of worrisome signs of our health, and now we had to deprive ourselves from visiting doctors for almost 2 years. So allocating healthcare services preparedness, which we could see was not adequate in many countries, even some developing countries. Privacy and autonomy should be also, I think, studied, because we had to provide a lot of data about ourselves, and we have to learn what are the overall longer-term consequences of this without giving up our autonomy. And new methods of protection should be developed. So I believe that human rights should be reconsidered in a way in order to reaffirm it. And if we just leave it as it was before without considering the adequate balance between social welfare rights and civil liberties, I think we would lose this important moment. I would like to thank you for your attention with this last picture. This is a small detail from the Margaret Island from Budapest, when you can see the stones, which memories for the victims of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jody, for that very helpful reminder of the many human rights and ethical implications of responses to COVID-19. I will just again ask on you to hold on to your questions and call upon Professor Siri Glopen. This is our last speaker for this panel. Siri, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, well, I would encourage you all to get up and stretch a little bit. It's incredibly hot, and I'm not going to be quite as exciting as the previous speakers, because I'm a political scientist and we're not as good storytellers. So get up and stretch. Research shows that it's impossible to concentrate in a hot and stuffy room for this long. So that is actually quite important. Okay, and I'm going to steal this water. Okay, so as a political scientist, I'm going to talk about the political dynamics of the pandemic. I'm going to talk about the effects on democracy and on sexual and reproductive rights and health. And in the first part of the lecture, or presentation, I will talk about effects on quality of governance, and then I'll present an overview of some global trends, and I'll rely on some public sources that I guess are familiar to most of you. Mostly I'll use the varieties of democracy, VDEM, statistics. I'll also use the COVID-19 civic freedom tracker, and the Lex Atlas COVID-19, a bit that you already heard about. And then in the second part, I will zoom in on some East African countries and the effects of the pandemic, looking particularly both at political effects but also effects on vulnerable groups. And looking particularly at the rights and health of LGBTIQ people. I will not talk about sex workers for the sake of time, but I'll look at Uganda, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. And in the end, I'll say something about what we can know from this experience that we've had going forward researching global health emergencies. So this is a map of pandemic violations of democratic standards in the world. All the maps are between March 2019 and June 2021. So it's the first it starts before the pandemic, but it goes in this from the start of the pandemic and then until a year ago. And what we see here is very interesting because we see that there are variation in all parts of the world. Countries in all parts of the world score get a green card. I mean, they score without violations. That are the green countries. The light blue ones have some violations, and the purple ones have serious violations of democratic standards during the pandemic, and or pandemic-related violations. And what's also interesting is that very few actually are green. There are actually very few green countries, very few countries without any violations of democratic standards in the handling of the pandemic. And if we look at Europe, it's also very interesting that countries that are quite similar, like the Scandinavian countries or Spain and Portugal, score quite differently. So in Scandinavia, Denmark and Finland have no violations, Norway have some, Sweden have more. We also see that there are some countries that have quite serious violations, including Poland. But these maps do not say anything about the general level of liberal democracy during this period. So these are just the pandemic-related violations. So I also wanted to show you that the picture of the liberal democracy index for the same period. And there we also see that there are a lot of variation within all of the regions. But here, the darker colored countries are the better ones. So the dark blue are the ones with good scores on liberal democracy. The white ones are the ones with very low scores. And the gray ones everywhere are missing data. If we go back to Europe, we see that there are also differences here. And we see that now it's not the same countries. It's not the countries that score poorly on liberal democracy that have violations relating to the handling of the pandemic. Some are, but many of the countries who have quite serious violations actually score well on liberal democracy. But we see that some countries, like for instance Poland, have quite poor standards of liberal democracy index, but also on handling of the pandemic. And then, in a way, if we combine the two, but also adding a lot of other factors, we get what is called the pandemic backsliding index. And the pandemic backsliding index says something about the risk that the pandemic poses to long-term democratic governance in the countries. So what can we say? How can we sort of expect these violations during the pandemic and the handling of the pandemic to affect long-term democracy in the country? And one of the things that we see is that the red countries here are the alarms. That's where the biggest problems are. And we see that among these countries are some of the most largest democracies in the world. So India is red, where the pandemic poses long-term threats to democratic governance. Brazil, maybe neither is so very surprising, but also Argentina, Mexico, Uganda. And so there are quite a few, the Philippines, Malaysia, so there are quite a few countries where this is the case. So none of the countries in Europe are on the highest alert, but we see that, for instance, Poland and Hungary are countries where it poses a risk, but also Greece. If we go to Africa, there is only one country, one African country, where the pandemic index says that there is a long-term threat to democratic governance, and that is Uganda. And that is very interesting, because if you look at that's the yellow map, remember, right? And then if you look at the map on the left-hand side, the upper map on the left-hand side, that's pandemic violations. And what we see is that almost all African countries had quite serious pandemic-related violations of democratic standards. Yet, only Uganda is seen to present a long-term threat. We also see the lower is the liberal democracy. The map where we see that South Africa is one of the few countries with high standards of liberal democracy, but also high standard of pandemic-related violations, but not big risks to long-term democracy. So what does this say? What does all these maps tell us about what's behind? What are the dynamics behind? So one reason, and that is illustrated well by looking at Africa, one reason is that countries are really different in terms of how the pandemic hit. Most African countries didn't have a very serious pandemic situation. South Africa did. They put in place really serious measures, but they also had a very serious situation on the ground. And of course, that is also one of the factors that we need to take into account. Yeah, so this just shows that the three countries that I look at more in detail were really different. So Ethiopia did not, well, it doesn't. So Ethiopia is lowest on liberal democracy, very low. Mozambique and Uganda is lower than Mozambique, but more or less the same. But only Uganda had pandemic-related the most serious pandemic-related violations and the threat to democracy long-term. Of course, Ethiopia doesn't have much democracy to start with, so that is also important to take into account. Okay, so what we saw in the three countries were that all of the countries had some forms of lockdowns in the beginning. They put in place quite a lot of measures. But in most African countries and in Mozambique and Ethiopia, these were lifted quite soon. When the death figures didn't rise a lot, when the costs of the lockdowns became very clear, the conditions were eased. Ethiopia never had very strict measures on economic activity, and they relied more on entrance control, public awareness, tracking, and so on. So it was different responses. But Uganda stood apart. It had harsh measures in place for a long time. Curfews, transport bans, economic activity was very much restricted. Restrictions on gatherings, courts were closed. A lot of political violence in enforcing these measures. Schools were closed for almost 2 years, so that's the longest school closure in the world. You were talking about that yesterday at the Women's Breakfast, the effects of school closures. Uganda was very, very much on that. So it was only lifted in January this year. The last curfews were lifted in March. There were questionable legality of the restrictions, no legally declared state of emergency, and it affected rights such as the right to a fair hearing, with refusal to get access to clients in prison and so on. So it was really, really harsh. And the reason why I picked these three countries is that they can say a little bit about broader dynamics, because some of this we see also in other countries, the underlying factors. And yeah, I could wait, but you'll see it now. But one of the things, many things were similar. I mean, they were similar in the way the pandemic hit, similar in the economic structure where people rely, a lot of people are poor, they rely on day-to-day economic activities. The lockdowns posed severe problems for people in terms of getting enough food, getting subsistence. Also, of course, then the risks of demonstrations and turmoil. So this was quite similar. But what we see is that it was handled very differently. And one of the main differences were political dynamics, politics. And Uganda is a typical case of what we can call opportunistic repression during the pandemic. So in Ethiopia, there were elections coming up in early 2021. So what happened was that the pandemic regulations were really important in order to both handle opposition before the election, handle rallies, prevent the opposition from really campaigning, but also putting much more of a lockdown in and much harsher restrictions in areas and sectors where the opposition was strong. So, some research has shown this very clearly, that there is a very political pattern to the way the COVID restrictions were introduced. And this is, of course, so in part, the pandemic restrictions were used in the place of other types of regulation, but more effectively. But it was also shielded from international attention and sanctions. So usually you have to sort of, you get some, not necessarily give in, but you get a lot of international criticism, which was absent. And while there were domestic mobilization against the restrictions, the apparatus to control this was also much stronger. And as I'll look at it a little bit more now, there was also an anti-gay, anti-LGBT focus to some of the repression, and this is also part of a longer pattern, and also something we see in other parts of the world. No. I'm going to, these three countries, so in much of Africa, as I'm sure many of you know, there has over the past decade been a lot of mobilization and politicization of homosexuality in particular. But the continent varies a lot when it comes to both the politics of LGBT rights, but also the legal status. So in Mozambique, the same-sex relations have been legal since 2015. Discrimination of homosexuals or based on sexual orientation is illegal. There are still sort of unequal treatment. For instance, you can't register organizations to the same extent. There are many other restrictions, and there is also social discrimination, but on a lot lower level than in the other two countries. If we look at Ethiopia, same-sexual relations are criminalized. It carries a very high social stigma. There are no organizations publicly working for LGBT rights except online. There are no people who are publicly out as queer in the country. In Uganda, it's very different. But it's not politicized in Ethiopia. Only it's starting to be, but it's not a big political issue. In Uganda, it is a big political issue. It has been one of the biggest political issues since 2009. When a bill was placed before Parliament proposing death penalty for homosexuality, which I'm sure you all have heard about. This bill has been brought back every time there's an election, every time there is a need to draw attention away from corruption scandals and so on. So it's a big, big issue. But at the same time, LGBT organizations are very active. There are, in the country, there are some very high-profile gay, lesbian, and trans people in Uganda. So it's a mixed picture, and these three countries represent the range of African countries in this sense. What we see is that we did, as part of a project that I'm directing on political and legal determinants of sexual and reproductive health in 10 African countries, we did surveys in these three countries, and during the lockdown with LGBT people in both quantitative and qualitative interviews, and we see that some of the problems are the same in the three countries: deterioration of mental health, absence of support structures, lack of access to health services, that they could not freely exercise their sexuality or business, particularly for sex workers. They were forced back on the family. Because of lack of economic ability to do economic activities. Many of them then have the choice of going back into the closet or harassment, but also some, and particularly in Mozambique, reported that relations with the families improved and became better during this period. what we see particularly in Ethiopia and Uganda is that the gays were blamed for the pandemic. They were blamed for spreading the virus, but also in a more religious Sodom and Gomorrah type argument that is quite common. More generally, the pandemic was seen as a divine punishment for homosexual activity. So there were quite a bit of public discussions around that. But what we see is very different again in Uganda is that pandemic restrictions were used much more to arrest homosexuals in particular, also put them in prison for a long time, harassments. There was a big, many people who were arrested in the beginning. 19 people were arrested, held in detention for weeks without access to a lawyer and so on. So this was a big issue in the beginning, but also in terms of discrimination in policy and so on. So this is a picture that is interesting because the way minorities are treated and the way minorities are politically used during is always interesting because it says a lot about the conditions of society. But how this is done in the middle of the pandemic is also very important to say something about the political dynamics. To close, I will say a little bit more structured, and again, I know that this is difficult to read, but I'll say something about how we should think about effects of legal measures to address global health crisis. And I think, first of all, I think it's important to think about this both in terms of long-term effects and short-term effects and long-term effects, direct and indirect effects, but also different dimensions and categories. Of course, we always think about the health effects, and they're important. The health effects are always important. The socioeconomic effects, more generally, are important. Legal effects we've talked about, but I would also, and we've done that in this conference and other sessions as well, but think more carefully about the political effects. And for all of these dimensions, it's important to think about the conditioning factors. Which factors condition the differences that we see? And when it comes to both health and socioeconomic factors, the structure of the health system, the inequalities in society are really, really important. And unless they're very carefully addressed in the regulations, the regulations will inevitably exacerbate the differences that we see. So that's one of the main factors that it's important to really, really look carefully at the structure of inequalities in societies and the intersectionality that are in these inequalities. But also, what we've learned is that trust is really, really important. Trust has been super important for the way in which governments have been able to deal with the pandemic, but the pandemic has also affected the level of trust in society in many different ways, in all of these dimensions, actually. Talking particularly, since my time is up, on the political factors, that we need to think about the political opportunity structures that are there. What is it that, what can governments, how can they further their ambitions during the pandemic? And that is, and that has a lot to say for how the pandemic is handled and the political effects. And again, we have to look at this in terms of trust in government and political system, but also changed modes of politics. Restrictive measures are much easier to put in place once that has been done already. Anti-government politics has taken a new form and can also easily be revived. And all of this can also play into autocratization dynamics. So, let me see. Thank you.
Our three panelists have given us so much food for thought. Thank you very much. I think one of the most striking things that I picked up from your presentations, Pedro, was that the WHO could not even get Ethiopia to comply with their own guidelines. The Secretary General of WHO is an Ethiopian, but that sort of speaks volumes about strength of, or might say something about the relationship between the WHO and the Secretary General. But the other thing that's interesting, I mean, my own background is in public international law, as you know. There's, at the moment, a very live and at times bitter debate as to who should take the lead in the drafting of a treaty on pandemics. There are those who argue that the WHO, as the designated health body, should do so. But many public international lawyers say that a treaty on pandemics is not just about pandemics. It's about the effect of pandemics on human rights norms. It's about the effect of pandemics on governance structures. And that what you need, and here it's self-serving a bit, the International Law Commission, for instance, the argument has been made, would be the only body that would be able to see the holistic nature of a treaty on pandemics, in particular, the effect of such an instrument on wider questions of public international law. But listen, I don't think you came here to hear me, so maybe the floor is open for questions. All I'm going to say is we'll take 3 questions at a time. I think that's best, and you, sorry? And you, may I just ask that, yeah, you identify. I'm assuming there's someone, the light is right in my face too. So yeah, we'll take 3 questions and then we'll take it from there.
Hi, thank you very much. This was really illuminating. Atina Krajewska from the University of Birmingham. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I have a few comments, I guess, some which might be questions as well. So, Pedro, I was really struck by the fact that, you know, the question is, how did you assess the compliance or reliance on the WHO guidance? It struck me really that Brazil was really highly compliant when, you know, we know that a lot of, for example, the medical elite has gone against, you know, the vaccination guidance and so on and so forth. So I wondered what were the factors that you were taking into account. The second comment, and generally speaking, what the factors of this compliance are. And I'm sure you are at the beginning of the research, so I'm sure you're going to look at those as well. Second comment is more general. I think what the pandemic has generally illustrated is the already the problems that we faced with democracy, with the rule of law, and with the healthcare in general and global health. And it simply, in many cases, exacerbated the problems that existed already. So what Siri was talking about, you know, in terms of the opportunistic oppression, this has been going on already, and, you know, the international community hasn't really, you know, reacted properly before, and therefore, you know, this ability to go and hinder these rights and, you know, violate these rights even more appeared. So I think I'm always careful with trying to see, I mean, to some extent, obviously, it's obvious that COVID was a formative moment in many ways. But also, I think we shouldn't blame the pandemic for all the problems that existed, because many of those problems pre-existed the pandemic. And finally, my third point is about the, I guess, private actors. So we tend to focus now, I know this is a public law conference, and we tend to focus on public law and public law actors. But really, what the pandemic did, we tend to see, you know, national governments taking over from the WHO, let's say, in opposition to international law and so on. But really, when you scratch the surface, what happened was ramping privatization in healthcare services, and the lack of accountability of those, you know, and the lack of instruments, of public law instruments to deal with those sufficiently or effectively. And I think, you know, if we talk about the WHO future constitution or some form of constitutionalizing global health, I think it is paramount that, you know, social constitutionalism is taken into account as well. taking into account the private sector, the privatization, and the effects on social and economic rights, and the general, the effects of the neoliberal paradigm, right, on the way that we see the changes and the long-term effects. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah Birkenkötter. I'm based at ITAM in Mexico City. Thank you very much for an illuminating panel. I have a question that follows up on your comment to Siri, specifically on the slide where you presented the data on the pandemic backsliding. So my question there is, I don't know sort of like the criteria for the data on VDEM, but I was a little bit wondering in the same vein to what extent the backsliding was something that happened before and was maybe exacerbated during the pandemic, or what the kind of relationship between the pandemic and the backsliding was that VDEM is using there. And the other, that's sort of like more of an observation. I've found it a bit puzzling to see Germany, which is my country of origin, being portrayed in such a great way on that one slide in terms of not violating democratic standards, given that within Germany there has been quite a bit of debate about executive action and sort of like the legitimacy of certain organs that were not designed to undertake emergency measures to do them. So again, my question would be about sort of like the criteria that VDEMnet is using there. And to Pedro, I have a question relating to something that's a little bit unfair, I'm sorry about that, but something that you didn't mention, which is COVAX. So you spoke about sort of like compliance with WHO guidance in terms of emergency response, but when it came to operational activity, sort of like especially the vaccine distribution, I was wondering to what extent your sort of like very cautious plea or open question at the end, to what extent the WHO should be sort of like a pivotal point around which other global governance entities center, to what extent COVAX is not perhaps a counterexample, because in that case that was the attempt, but it didn't quite work out the way in which it was designed. So I would love to hear your observations on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these great presentations. Stefan Salomon from the University of Amsterdam. I would have two quick questions. The first one goes to Judith Sandor. So you basically described the negative effects on autonomy and mentioned kind of like the effect, the need to share data, etc. And I was wondering kind of like, what does it mean for an understanding of autonomy as we're used to if someone does not share the basic epistemic premises, but simply say refuses to get vaccinated because the pandemic as such does not exist. So kind of like to refuse to share basic epistemic kind of like premises in that could be kind of like that would be kind of like the standards in a discourse. And the second question goes to Pedro. So you mentioned accountability, and I was just wondering kind of like, did the project also kind of like dwell on accountability of the WHO, and which forms of accountability? Might this be legal, might this be political? If it is legal, how exactly kind of like would it look like? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I'll invite the panelists to respond to those first three questions, and I will ask you to respond in the... Are there any more hands? Okay. I suggest you respond to those, because maybe others are still thinking of their questions. May I ask you to respond in the order in which is, I mean, you can choose whichever order. Looks like you're very keen to go first.
No, well, yeah, well, I can. It was quite easy, but so I should, of course, have said something about how the VDEM data are compiled. And they use a lot of different sources, but the main source of these data are expert interviews. So in a way, it's like a massive qualitative interview database. That I always try to say to my students when they use it, don't sort of take it as this, because it is, like many other, actually, it is you ask 5 experts from each country, generally, ask them, how do you score the government on, and how do you assess all of it? It's like an enormous questionnaire, it takes forever. And then they do it every year. So they will ask the same experts, and then sometimes they say, you said this last year, how do you see it this year, and so on. So this is basically in-country experts, or experts on the country in some cases, who will be asked to assess. And that will be the same for democratic backsliding trends, that there will be a lot of, it will be many, many questions relating to it, but relating to different aspects. And then they're brought together to assess risks. So it is in part, of course, this often is part of long trends, where the pandemic, but the pandemic did something to the trends in many cases. And the pandemic regulations did something to the trends because they were really powerful instruments. And in some cases, it became like a, well, it went in different directions in different countries, but in some countries it sort of posed warning signs. It must also be said that these are data that were collected in late 2021, so they're from that period. So this is the first, a bit more than the first year of the pandemic. And I think in some countries, there's more criticism now, looking back, at the government's handling. And I think that's true definitely for Denmark, for Norway, for Germany. There has been a lot of commissions in place in many countries. So there is more of a discourse now, so maybe nobody would have a really totally green slate. So this must be taken as this assessment of the first period, which was crucial because the knowledge was so little and the government actions were often very dramatic.
I think many questions were related to that COVID pandemic just reinforces the tendencies which already occurred. And that's true that in the literature it's stated that disaster and emergency reinforce hegemonic tendencies. So we know it therefore I also started with historical examples, and many rulers previously knew this. If they have a power over reserve, they can also redistribute it later, and then they can also transform it into the political power. But we would see that emergency regulations in many countries, not only countries which were listed, but for instance in my country also related to restricting LGBT rights, for instance, reformulation of a fundamental law, and etc. As to the rebalancing the catalogue of human rights, and it is, if I understood correctly, the economic consequences of this revitalizing the catalogue, I think that what we understood from the pandemic, at least I hope, that actually it's also cost a lot for the economy, that we didn't have necessary preparedness. So in some countries, it's even in the times of the days when the pandemic was not that severe, people were deprived of medical care, which would be, I think, very detrimental even also in the long run. So we had to understood the better connection between economy and health. I think somehow it was always presented either or, and I think it's a wrong framework, because we have to see that health can be also of a great power for economy. And so I think that also, I remember I also present when I participated in a cost of rights conference. It was taken for granted that social welfare rights are the luxury, is something which should removed from the catalogue anytime there is economic problems. And then it turned out that even many civil liberties are also costly, and also the healthcare rights can also help for the better exercise of civil liberties. So it's that's also wanted to have a more dynamic picture between of different sets of rights, and to understand health is not just as a kind of burden for the budget, but it's also reinforcing the economy, and that's, I think, we could see during the pandemic.
Okay, thanks so much. And I'll try to be as brief as possible. I have 4 questions identified. 4 questions, and thanks for all of them. So to Atina, on your question on how these categories were designed, and of course there's an inherent degree of arbitrariness in how I designed them. But basically it was to show, in terms of how high this reliance was, to show that there were some instances identified in this comparative law analysis where, based on the decision by national authorities, right? This is, again, not an obligation under international law, but national authorities somehow decided to make some decisions of the WHO have direct legal consequences nationally. So this shows that there is indeed an intent to give these guidance by the WHO, for example, specific legal weight nationally. Again, it's contingent upon national authorities doing so. If they wish to, they do include it. And the example of Brazil, for instance, of course, it's worldly notorious because of the way in which the executive handled the pandemic. But of course, this decision was made by the legislative body, right? A different body altogether. And similar to Germany, where the German parliament, the Bundestag, was the one who decided to directly link national emergency declarations to the WHO's own declarations, to the extent that whenever there is such a declaration by the WHO, this can have direct legal consequences nationally. And of course, the scale goes lower and lower until in one of the reports, we saw that the author simply could not identify any reference, and indeed it's quite telling that this was the country of origin of the current WHO Director General, Ethiopia. Maybe there were some political elements at stake. He was, by the way, the former Minister of Health of Ethiopia in a previous government. So I don't know if this could be some factor to take into consideration. But to put a long story short, we did not find any, as yet, and I have not found any correlation between the political ideology of a government in turn, or the high level of income of a country to determine the likelihood that there will be a higher reliance upon the WHO. We see all types of countries with different political systems and different democratic credentials relying more or less on the WHO and without any strong correlation to these factors. But we can discuss these categories further if you want more granular information, of course. And the second question, which is related to Hannah Birkenkotta's question on the role of non-state actors and private actors, particularly. And indeed, I think this is, we can discuss this further, for example, in public international law, and as Vivio Kowa, of course, has pointed out. There's this limitation that we always focus on states and particularly on governments as the point of departure, also in public law more generally, where indeed what we see is that in the facts, these private actors do play an oversized role, I would say, in the field of health. The question is what to do at different governance levels. At the international level, we do have the limitation that the classic subjects of international law being states, well, as governments, the ones we hold accountable. But what about all these other private actors? How do we hold them directly accountable? And this, of course, includes, just to mention one example that relates to Hannah Birkenkotta's question, for instance, pharmaceutical companies that, we saw what type of role they played during the pandemic, and how the global distribution of vaccines was far from being equitable. And this does relate to the existing market model of pharmaceutical research and development, where these private actors are, of course, the ones singing or let's say, paving the way towards what will be done. And so how do we hold them accountable under international or European or national law? This is a big question. Under the international law, it's quite limited. But for instance, with regards to the COVAX initiative, which was one initiative that was aimed at a more equitable global distribution of vaccines, it is also quite telling and quite noticeable how, okay, indeed, the WHO was part of this initiative, although the one that handled the operative part was Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, a public-private partnership, right? It's not an international organization composed of member states. It's a public-private partnership with funding from different sources, a non-state actor. And this is, the main reasoning is that since pharmaceutical research and development operates under a market logic, it was somehow necessary that an actor with experience under this market logic, namely this public-private partnership with decades of experience in pharmaceutical procurement and distribution, we needed an actor that could somehow enter this market logic, and the WHO was not seen as the most fit actor. And this, of course, does speak of its being somehow not fully capable of really coping with this complicated market logic where there are these economic actors, pharmaceutical companies namely, do have their own ways of doing things, do have their own criteria upon which will determine to whom they will sell pharmaceutical products and on which price. So this is again a part where the WHO has a very limited role, unfortunately, to play. As Filiakova was referring, that's why maybe there have been other fora being pointed as potential alternatives to overcome these obstacles of the mandate of the WHO. So regarding the last question on accountability, and I appreciate the comment, I didn't include it as part of this study I just presented, but we do have, as part of the Global Health Law Consortium, in how the WHO exercises its emergency powers. Right? We do have a paper, Mark Eccleston-Turner from King's College London and I published recently at the International Organization's Law Review, where we do look into different models of accountability, which can be either through member states, right? Member states can hold the WHO accountable, but there can be other ways of accountability. It's not just member states. It can be the WHO is also dependent on a lot of donations in its budget from several sources. And these actors, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that donate substantively to the WHO, can also hold the WHO accountable by, for instance, threatening to withdraw the funding if they don't agree with what the WHO is doing. And of course, this creates some incentives. Not all of them are positive. But, and even there may be other bodies, like national bodies, for instance, from governments that contribute to the WHO that can also, hold the WHO accountable by saying, well, we are giving you taxpayer money, national taxpayer money, so these taxpayers are, of course, expecting results. So this is another way in which national authorities can hold the WHO accountable by entering these dynamics of, getting their money's worth, so to say, for what they're contributing to the WHO's budget. So, thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you very much for responding to that round of questions. I'm just trying to look in the audience whether there are any other persons with burning questions. Sorry? Well, unless there's a burning question.
No one's talking.
There is a question right here. Yeah. We started late.
Yeah, we started late.
Yeah. Well, we'll take that question.
We'll take questions. Yeah. We're not in a rush.
Thank you very much for these fantastic presentations of all of you and very interesting discussions after that. I have just having a privilege for the last summarizing question. Could you probably briefly, as a summary, all of you suggest, because the conversation was focused predominantly on national measures, what do you think would be the next step for undertaking particular institutional changes on the global level? Whether they are necessary, possible, and what kind of measures we should expect in order to improve the global standards of healthcare. Thank you very much.
Judith, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, I think that one of the measures, there are many things which can be done. I think that science and society should develop a better communication, that I refer to that the public didn't get used to having information of how, for instance, vaccines are developed. And because of the so-called projectology, the scientists were bound to share only success stories. And I think once they able to understand that the public needs an information and the public needs to get used to that a science is not something that you can have immediate success and results, they can be hesitations, they can be discarded idea. That would be very important for the next pandemic, or to understand what is at stake. But this is about science and society. The other is preparedness, which I think I was very much surprised that public health measures, which were in older healthcare acts previously, were totally forgotten. And people didn't get used that there are some cases when the community interest is very important, and they got used to certain diseases which affect children, but not so much for the entire population. Also of reporting between countries, and especially in the beginning, how Europe was hit by the pandemic, and Italy asked for help, but nevertheless didn't receive response. Also better sharing resources. There were some times when we didn't have masks in certain parts of Europe. So there are many things which can be done, and reason I refer to history, and not so distant history, but somehow we have a perception that these are extreme cases which will not happen again. And if we're looking at, since just the Second World War, when there was a typhus, polio, SARS, avian flu, then we have to see that it's a part of our life. So we should not say that, okay, this happened once. The preparedness, and it should be incorporated in the preparation of laws, in information, teaching, education. It should not be considered as an extraordinary, never again happen incident. And I think it was not in our thinking before the COVID pandemic, irrespective that we already witnessed several epidemics and pandemics. Maybe some of them were localized, certain part of the world, but anyhow, I think this should be done not only in the healthcare sector, not only in planning the budget of a surplus for the healthcare in case of pandemic, but it also has to help with how science and society communicates, and also how it's incorporated into the education.
Thank you. Of course, this is a super, super important question, a difficult one. I would say, and following up on what some people have been talking about, that to re-examine the power structures and the role of capital in international health, global health governance is super important. I mean, the pandemic really, really showed the extreme importance of big money in global health, and that the way we've organized our health systems both globally and domestically that there are fundamental flaws, and that this needs to be reassessed, and it needs to be reformed, because there is something about the strongest countries in the global north and the strongest companies dictating so much of how global health functions. So of course that's not easy, because that's where power is, but I think that is where we really, really need to think about what we can do. And I also think when it comes to the initiatives that are super important, that are on universal health coverage around the world in different systems, I mean, we've seen how extremely broken and unequal access health systems are around the world. And I think in these discussions which is a global discussion on universal health coverage, one of the things that have been off the table a lot has been not financing, but how much difference it makes if there are private actors in the health systems. The discussion about sort of public funding of health system need to be also brought in, and because I think that this is something that has been very clear, that the systems both domestically and internationally are too vulnerable when they rely on private funding and private healthcare to the extent.
Just briefly, and thanks for that pressing question. Indeed, I follow up on the preceding comments and will only add, one challenge that we identified to really speak of a global approach, and the one that often comes up, and particularly, for example, in ongoing negotiations in Geneva on a new instrument, international law instrument on pandemic response. So how to break this dynamics or this inertia that, for example, people that will go to Geneva and negotiate, the new rules for the globe, they will represent their own national constituencies, right? They will represent their own countries, the population of their own countries. And we're still working under this logic that, okay, they want to do, of course, what's best for their own countries, but this is still the mindset of the national mindset that, of course, if we're facing a global problem, it may clash with what is really a global approach towards solidarity. For example, as Siri was mentioning, the role of power and money. Of course, those high income economies will do whatever they can to protect their own population, even if it means outbuying the lower income economies when it comes to medicine stockpiling, for example, scarcity in medicines, where we see that the representatives of their constituencies will act in favor of their constituencies, even if that means leaving other countries out of it. So how do we break this really nationalist mindset at the international fora? Just to mention one example, is to me one challenge, because of course we delegates that represent countries cannot be expected to act otherwise when they go to their populations, and the populations will say, what did you do for us? Not what did you do for the population of other countries. But this to me is a stalemate or a dilemma where we need to find ways to really underscore, as Judith presented, that really we're in this, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. So really this nationally focused mindset towards facing pandemics, in my view at least, should somehow be overcome. How to do it, of course, is $1 million question. I don't have a definitive answer, but this is where we currently try to overcome this challenge of, looking more globally and not just inwards. That's on my side.
Well, I think we are well past our allocated time, and it's time to bring this session to a close so that you can get back to coffee, have a break before you join the next sessions. But before we do that, can you join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists who've done a very good job of giving us a roadmap in one of the most entrenched and difficult problems that's going to be with us for quite some time. Actually, almost all the international law organizations that I know, the Institute of International Law, the International Law Association, the International Law Commission, the Council of Europe, have the question of pandemics on their agenda. So in some form, somewhere along the lines, we're going to have a roadmap on how we take these things forward. It may be that eventually it will be at a multilateral conference convened by the United Nations and not necessarily the WHO, because of these multifaceted aspects of the pandemic. And crucially, I think codifying obligations of solidarity are inherently very, very problematic. So without saying any more, I think I will say, yeah, go and enjoy your coffee. But before we do that, let's thank our panelists.